Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal. World of Warcraft is an ever-changing game with multiple expansions worth of history that has been created over the past 20 years. It is a competitive game where players can participate in group activities like raids, dungeons, and PvP combat, where many strive to become the very best they can at the class they fell in love with, or switching up their mains often to stay competitive when it comes to endgame updates. And as much as we want the game to be balanced between its 13 classes and 39 class specs, historically it's never been a purely well-tuned experience. Recently I spent some time doing a bit of a history dive into WoW classes, mostly researching talents, abilities, and spells which were removed over the last few years. And I came to a conclusion that most of these were axed out because they were broken, or because they made certain classes pretty overpowered for their time. That other video idea has since been scrapped. Probably, but I didn't want the research to go to waste. So today I wanted to go over the 10 moments in WoW history where certain classes were deemed to be truly OP by big swaths of the WoW population without including major class exploits. But right before we get into an off-the-topic channel video, most of you guys watching these kind of updates are still not subscribed. However, the more of you remind, the more of you do. So let's keep it going. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell if you're watching these videos anyway. Especially if you want to get more regular content regarding Dragonflight 10.2 or any of the future updates going forward. Let's start this highlight from its very origins 20 years ago, during the launch of World of Warcraft before all of the expansions. Azeroth back then was still a very mysterious place to large portions of the player base, with plenty of unknowns around every corner. Information sharing was not nearly as common and simple as it is today, so when players figured out a way to gain certain class abilities, learned about new game mechanics, or found hidden interactions, it left you ahead of the curve from every other player, which was especially strong in early competitive PvP content. Early on, rogues figured out just how strong they are for PvP, as they were the one class that had access to the most amount of control abilities, with many of them on a different diminishing returns, meaning that you could chain all of them together without losing out on their durations. What tied this combination together was preparation, a talented skill which would reset all of your cooldowns. Everything from your blind, your stuns, and even those vanishes that would help incapacitate your target with saps. Of course, prep had other uses like resetting your defensives and offensives, but just the crowd control alone was enough to let a rogue stun lock the target into an oblivion, so they could take out any enemy they wanted to with zero resistance, taking their health bar all the way down to zero. And to add insult to injury, they were able to do so without any gear, using a starting level 1 rogue dagger. And I feel like nothing else really ever came close to highlighting just how overpowered a class was at PvP at the time. And while we're on the topic of highlighting legendary moments from vanilla WoW, you have to add in the Rag Bomb Paladin into this list. The Reckoning mechanic allowed Paladins to store up additional auto attacks every time they got hit by critical strikes. However, all of those extra additional attack charges would only be depleted once you attacked an enemy target. So until you swung your weapon at a target, you would be able to store up all of these charges. And one paladin decided to take this mechanic to an extreme and spent roughly about 3 hours of getting crit over and over by another player with a dagger up until they were able to build up to 2,000 stacks of Reckoning at a time. Now, normally when you get hit by an attack, there's only a chance that you may be crit, depending on the enemy's gear and their setup and their stats. But you could also guarantee a critical strike if you were sitting down. Being attacked while sitting down would mimic old school RPG mechanics and even tabletop RPGs, whereas if you're sitting down, it's almost like you're resting at a camp, and if another entity attacks you, it will be counted as an ambush. So to simulate this ambush mechanic, they decided to make it where if you are sitting down and you get attacked, it is a guaranteed critical strike. So with enough patience and a couple of broken daggers later, one paladin was able to walk up to a world boss and solo him all by himself. Obviously, this was way too overpowered, so they nerfed this mechanic immediately by putting a new cap on the Reckoning and how many stacks you could have at one time. But nothing will make you feel more powerful than being able to topple down a massive open world boss all by your lonesome, becoming essentially a one-man raid with enough patience and some preparation. A couple of expansions later, warriors got access to a talent called Gag Order. Back in Wrath of the Lich King, Gag Order was a talent that you found pretty deep into the protection talent tree. that would allow abilities such as Shield Slam and Throw Weapon to also silence your target. In Cataclysm, they revamped all of the talent trees, and they moved the position of Gag Order. While it was still in the Protection Talent Tree section, you didn't have to commit too far down to pick up this talent to use as Arms or Fury, which allowed both of those DPS warrior specs to use Pummel or Heroic Throw to outright silence an enemy target from a distance. Normally, most melee classes at the time had to get up close before they could interrupt, let alone silence them outright, which was available for only a handful of specs, and warriors were able to do so from a distance, which at the time was kind of broken. On top of having fantastic mobility for Cataclysm, plenty of crowd control abilities such as full-on stuns and fears, and even access to a way to remove immunities from enemy targets by using Shattering Throw, many felt that it was kind of overpowered to have one class to be able to do all of it for PvP specifically. Another mechanic that was introduced during Cataclysm was Vengeance, which was a tank-only mechanic. For a bit now, you had tanks and DPS players wrestling each other for aggro. As tanks are supposed to maintain aggro, it becomes harder and harder as you keep making all the DPS classes stronger and stronger. Vengeance was introduced to make it a little bit easier for tanks to hold aggro against their DPS counterparts. With Vengeance, the more damage a tank took, the more damage their abilities would deal, and this mechanic would stack and stack and stack. At the time, you didn't really have a lot of stopgaps, so in PvE and even in PvP content, tanks getting hit would keep growing stronger and stronger until they reached that critical mass where they could one-shot other players or do simply absurd damage in dungeons or in raids. Over time, however, they did end up adjusting Vengeance as we went from Cataclysm to Mists of Pandaria, where they initially limited Vengeance to scale with the tank's health, and didn't allow Vengeance to build by getting hit by other players. But as characters got better gear throughout Mists of Pandaria, Vengeance just kept getting stronger and stronger, which saw additional changes in order to try to keep it down as best as possible. Eventually, they couldn't fight it anymore, and they just removed Vengeance mechanic out of the game entirely and simply increased the amount of threat a tank would generate without increasing their overall damage. But during the early days of Vengeance, that is where most tanks claimed to have felt the strongest in terms of defense, utility, but also most importantly in terms of the raw overall damage that they could bring into the raid or party. During Mists of Pandaria, we also got introduced to the Warlock talent of Kil'Jaeden's Cunning, which is a talent that would allow you to cast spells while on the move. Casting while moving at the time was very uncommon since most classes were designed with having to stand still while using most of their casted abilities. Initially, Kil'Jaeden's Cunning was an active ability on a minute cooldown, which would give you a short window to free cast while heavily reducing your movement. However, over time they pulled back on the movement reduction aspect, and eventually Kil'Jaeden's Cunning became simply a passive skill which allowed you to cast certain basic filler abilities on the move, specifically Incinerate, Shadow Bolt, or Malefic Grasp, depending if you played Destruction, Demonology, or Affliction. And since most casters were designed around limited mobility, Warlocks being given the freedom to free cast their Chaos Bolts while on the run was a game changer, which is why every one of my PvP friends rolled a Destruction Warlock alt at some point throughout Mists of Pandaria. While we're talking about Mists of Pandaria, we also gotta highlight the Druid's Symbiosis ability, which would simply allow you to swap a spell with one of your allies, gaining a new powerful combination depending on your spec and the other person's class, which allowed for a variety of different spell combinations that could be shared with others. For Restoration Druids, for the most part, you get access to new defenses, as well as unique mobility abilities such as Leap of Faith Grip or Demonic Circle Teleport that would instantly port you to the Warlock's pre-placed circle. Guardian Druids for the most part got defensives, as well as utility spells such as Fear Ward, Ice Trap, and Life Tap, which would convert your health into Rage. Feral and Balanced DPS Druids got a mixed bag of things, with immunities such as Cloak of Shadows or Divine Shield, utility spells such as Grapple Weapon or Frost Nova, or offensive spells such as Hammer of Justice and Soul Swap to transfer your bleeds to a new target. The sheer amount of combinations the Druids or other classes could gain was absolutely astronomical and would even be game-breaking to some degree, as Druids could get access to immunities to bypass certain raid mechanics. So instead of having to have your raid soak a boss mechanic, instead you could just send a Restoration Druid with an Ice Block to immune it. And there were so many other abilities that you would grant to other classes, like giving Paladins Battle Res before they got one in Dragonflight, giving Restoration Shaman Stealth, or even Tranquility for Shadow Priest. Some of these things were much better than others, so there was a bit of variance in just how useful they were. But some of the best combinations were absolutely legendary, maybe even too good. good enough for them to remove it for the next expansion. Right before we head into the Warlords of Draenor section, we do have one more ability to talk about, which is the Brewmaster's Guard ability, which was prominent during MoP and WoD days. Guard would allow a Brewmaster to absorb all future attacks, which would also scale with Vengeance, which is quite important since we covered the ability early on. Guard by itself had a 30-second duration, 30-second cooldown, and would allow all healing on yourself to be increased by 30% while Guard was active. And earlier we talked about just how strong Vengeance was, and how it went through a couple of different iterations up until it was removed out of Warlords of Draenor. But while it was active, monks would go through periods where they would take damage directly into their health bar, which would scale their Vengeance, which would scale their Guard, and would allow them to use Guard in such a way where the absorb shield was just big enough to essentially immune some of the strongest boss abilities in the game, nullifying the mechanic entirely, which is also kind of game breaking. Eventually, in Warlords of Draenor, it became a 50% damage reduction on a 15-second cooldown that also had multiple charges attached to it, which was on its own a pretty strong defensive ability. It is a much stronger version than what the current Celestial Brew is. It was an ability that allowed monks to be able to utilize it during certain specific moments to become essentially unstoppable, becoming one of the few tanks that could actually ignore boss mechanics or even break certain encounters with just proper play. As we get into the Warlords of Draenor expansion, it is very difficult to not go through this expansion without at least mentioning the aspect of the Fox, which was a hunter-only raid buff that allowed your allies to move while being able to cast all of their abilities for the next few seconds. Earlier, we talked about just how strong Kil'Jaeden's Cunning was on Destruction Warlocks, so now take that mechanic and apply it to your entire raid. Unlike before, it was incredibly powerful because casters were designed with the lack of movement in mind, so this ability basically broke that rule for a handful of seconds. But the best part is a coordinated big guild was able to coordinate multiple hunters using these abilities to create phases where healers and casters would be able to go to maximize their healing and damage while still staying on the move. Well-organized groups would be able to squeeze the most amount of value of aspect of the Fox, which would make the class of Hunter an invaluable asset for any raid group that was progressing through that expansion's content. And the worst part is the ability was removed before most hunters even really had the chance to have fun with the ability long enough, with raid buff added at the start of the expansion but then axed a couple of patches later. Another ability that came and went was the Rogue's Burst of Speed within Warlords of Draenor, which was an ability that was basically sprint but with an energy cost and sometimes a cooldown that would also remove all movement impairing effects. Generally, being on top of a mount is going to be faster than sprinting, but if you are dismounted, like if you're stuck in combat or are in PvP, being able to burst the speed in and out of a situation was much faster than any other player could move at the time. And for a little bit, the ability also used to break all root effects, which would let rogues escape other players with absolute ease. Used to have also no cooldown either, and eventually got a 3-second cooldown where you could just spam the ability every time you got hit with a player's slow, which meant in PvP terms that you couldn't lock a rogue down, not unless you could chain stones back together. Roots, slows, snares, nothing could stop them, and if they just wanted to exit combat, there's nothing you could do to stop them from doing so. And at the time, rogues were already seen as pretty much broken for PvP content by a majority of the population. As we covered earlier, they have access to 1 million stuns. But now you can't even stop a rogue from fleeing and losing battle either. And in a lot of cases, movement can be just as strong as any defensive if you can simply run away from danger. And finally, the last class that we could classify as plenty OP was the class of Death Knight during the launch of Wrath of the Lich King. For a bit, I did think about talking about the Death Knights earlier in the video when we talked about Wrath and Cataclysm era, but after my research, I decided to save the very best for last because Blizzard were really cooking when they made the very first hero class of an expansion. To begin with, every spec of Death Knight could literally do everything in the game, from tanking, DPSing, PvPing, and you could play it however you wanted to. Or most classes maybe had one viable options for raids and maybe one playstyle for PvP, Death Knights literally had the most freedom out of everybody. They also came in with a ton of powerful abilities, from a 1-minute cooldown of Icebound Fortitude, a spell which reduced damage taken and at some point broke you out of stuns and made you immune. Death and Decay, which at some point even had a Horrify effect, where enemies standing in Death and Decay would periodically be hoarded in place. Blood Aura would grant your allies passive leech. Frost Presence would increase your armor and even reduce magic damage baseline by 15%. Chain of Ice would practically root enemies in place, and certain abilities would even eat other players' buffs in PvP combat, which was originally a unique mechanic only designated for a handful of classes. But even besides all of the strongest spells and abilities that they had access to, they also had a great starting new player experience. You got access to a mount fairly quickly on, and even had a good set of gear so you could jump straight into the TBC to level your character. And you never had to slow down to recover resources such as mana. You could just go from quest to quest, fighting through enemies, healing yourself while in combat, and in some of the early TBC dungeons, you were able to do the most amount of damage, which gave you some of the best and the fastest leveling out there. And since the release back in Wrath, Death Knight saw only nerfs after nerfs since the release of Wrath of the Lich King, with every single patch chipping away at the overall strength. The culmination of those nerfs ends up being the Death Knight that you can right now experience in Wrath Classic, which by some standards still has a bit of an early lead when it comes to the early player experience. Historically, it was World of Warcraft's very first hero class to ever be conceptualized and released into an expansion, and would create somewhat of a standard as to how they would release some of the future hero classes, like Demon Hunters back in Legion, or the most recent edition of Evokers in the expansion of Dragonflight. And while all of those other classes did have pretty strong starts for their relative expansions, none of them ever came close to the legendary opening that Death Knights have had during the early days of Wrath. Definitely a very different video for what we usually do here on the channel, but I was putting some research together for a project which may still come to a fruition at some point in the future, but for now I put it on ice. But I really didn't want this research to go to waste. There's a lot of cool WoW history that's hidden with every single expansion, and digging through it bit by bit has been actually quite enjoyable, especially for some of the Cataclysm and on, since that's more or less when I started playing, but also going through some of the older footage and some of the accounts of players from back then, as well as all the different patch updates from those expansions also. It's been actually a bit of an eye-opening experience, and kind of makes me wish that I did play this game when it initially launched with the original vanilla World of Warcraft. As per usual, if you guys enjoyed this video or found it informative, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. I would very much appreciate it. And as always, in the description of every single video and live stream, we have a link to our Discord community channel, probably the best place to reach out to me directly in case you want to let me know what you thought about this video, or hang out with the rest of the community to discuss some of the upcoming changes. Join our Discord to become part of the community. But otherwise, thank you all so much for watching this video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know all of your thoughts down below, and as always, I'll see all of you guys in another video.